In the dead of night, when the world seems draped in a thick, suffocating silence, there's one name that no one dares to whisper into the darkness: Bloody Mary. It's not the sort of tale you find in the pages of a dusty book or hidden in the footnotes of forgotten history. No, Bloody Mary lives in whispers, passed from trembling lips in darkened rooms, a ghost story that grows more sinister with every retelling. Her legend is woven into the fabric of nightmares, a tale so chilling that even skeptics feel their hearts quicken at the mere mention of her name. It begins with a mirror. They say mirrors are more than reflective glass. They are portals, thin veils separating our world from the unknown. And when the right words are spoken under the right conditions, that veil tears. The ritual is deceptively simple, which makes it all the more terrifying. Stand in front of a mirror, a single candle flickering weakly in the shadows. Gaze into your reflection, but not directly. Look just beyond, into the depths of the glass, into the void that waits beyond. Then speak her name, not once, not twice, but 3 times. Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary. If you're lucky, nothing happens. The room stays still, the flame wavers in its own rhythm, and you exhale, laughing nervously at your own foolishness. But if you're unlucky, the air changes. It grows colder, heavier, oppressive. Shadows deepen, and your reflection in the glass doesn't move quite the same way you do. And then she comes. They say Bloody Mary is beautiful in her horror, her ghastly visage unforgettable. Her hair, matted and black, drips with a darkness that stains the floor beneath her. Her skin is pale, like a corpse exhumed from shallow ground, and her eyes burn with an unnatural light. Her lips, twisted in a cruel smile, drip with blood, as if she's just finished feasting on her latest victim. And her hands, those clawed, skeletal hands, reach through the glass as though it were water, grasping for the foolish soul who summoned her. What happens next depends on who you ask. Some say she'll pull you into the mirror, trapping your soul for eternity in her shadowy world. Others claim she'll gouge your eyes out, leaving you to wander the earth blind, a living warning to those who might follow in your footsteps. And then there are those who believe she doesn't kill you right away. She follows you, haunts you, drives you to the edge of madness before finally dragging you screaming into the abyss. But where did she come from? Every version of the legend seems to offer a different origin, each one more chilling than the last. Some say she was a witch, burned at the stake by a fearful village that accused her of hexing their children. As the flames consumed her, she cursed the people and vowed to return, her vengeance eternal. Others whisper of a queen, a beautiful, powerful woman whose enemies betrayed her, staining her hands with blood as she fought to keep her throne. Betrayed and bleeding, she swore to take her revenge, her wrath echoing through the centuries. Yet the most unsettling version of the tale is the one rooted in the idea of innocence corrupted. According to this story, Mary was once an ordinary girl, kind, gentle, and curious about the world. She had a fascination with mirrors, spending hours gazing into them, captivated by her reflection. But something changed. One day, she claimed to see things in the mirror that weren't there. Faces, shadows, whispers of another world. Her family dismissed it as a child's imagination, but Mary grew obsessed. She began performing strange rituals in the dead of night, staring into the glass and chanting words in a language no one recognized. Then, one night, she disappeared. Her body was never found, but her mirror remained. It was cold to the touch, its surface dark and rippling, as though something lived within. The family, distraught and terrified, sold the house and left the town. But the legend of Bloody Mary had already begun to take root. It was said that anyone who looked into that mirror could see her, standing just behind them, her hand reaching for their throat. Over the years, the legend spread like wildfire, taking on a life of its own. Children whispered about it at sleepovers, daring one another to stand in front of a mirror and call her name. Some laughed it off as nonsense, but others weren't so lucky. There were stories, dozens of them, of kids who never came back, their parents finding nothing but shattered glass and bloody handprints. There were accounts of people who survived, but were never the same. Their eyes hollow, their minds fractured, haunted by something they couldn't escape. The thing about Bloody Mary is that her story feels alive, as if it grows stronger with every telling, every terrified whisper in the dark. Maybe that's why the legend never dies. It's not just a story, it's a warning, a reminder that some boundaries are not meant to be crossed, some names not meant to be spoken. And yet, the allure is undeniable. Humans are curious creatures, drawn to the forbidden like moths to a flame. So the question lingers in the air, heavy and taunting. Would you dare? Would you stand before the mirror, heart hammering in your chest, and summon her? Would you risk everything to see if the stories are true? The answer, of course, is the same for everyone. You wouldn't. You couldn't. And yet, as you sit there in the dark, staring at your own faint reflection in the window, you wonder, what if? And as that thought creeps into your mind, unbidden and unstoppable, you feel the faintest chill, as though someone or something is watching. From the other side of the glass. The town of Black Hollow was the kind of place you only found on a map if you were lost. Tucked deep within a forest that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, the town was shrouded in perpetual twilight, its streets blanketed by a fog that never quite lifted. Black Hollow was old, older than the rusted signs that marked its borders or the crumbling graveyard on the hill. It was a town where secrets festered in the dark and whispers traveled faster than the wind. The legend of Bloody Mary thrived here, passed from generation to generation like an unwanted heirloom. The townsfolk didn't speak of her openly, but her presence lingered in every cracked mirror, every warped pane of glass. There were stories, of course, stories of the curious and the foolish, of children who dared to call her name and were never seen again. Most people dismissed these tales as folklore, but in Black Hollow, superstition ran deep. Doors were locked before dusk, mirrors were covered in black cloths, and no one dared utter her name, even in jest. It was here that 4 teenagers decided to tempt fate. Emily, Jake, Sarah, and Logan were inseparable in the way only teenagers in small towns could be. Black Hollow had little to offer in the way of entertainment, and the 4 of them spent their days dreaming of escape and their nights finding trouble. They were an unlikely group, brought together more by proximity than shared interests, but their bond was unshakable. Emily was the de facto leader of the group, though not by choice. She was practical, level-headed, and fiercely protective of her friends. With her sharp wit and piercing blue eyes, she had a way of commanding attention without trying. Emily had grown up hearing her grandmother's whispered warnings about Bloody Mary, and though she dismissed them as nonsense, the stories had left their mark. She often caught herself avoiding mirrors at night, a habit she hated but couldn't break. Jake was the opposite of Emily, reckless, brash, and always looking for the next thrill. With his shaggy brown hair and cocky grin, He was the kind of guy who could talk his way out of anything. Jake loved the thrill of a good scare, and it was his idea to explore the Bloody Mary legend. To him, it was all just a game, a chance to prove he wasn't afraid of anything. "It's just a stupid story," he said. "What's the worst that could happen?" Sarah was the heart of the group, gentle and empathetic, with an almost childlike curiosity about the world. She had a soft voice that people often talked over, but her quiet demeanor hid a stubborn streak. Sarah believed in things the others didn't: ghosts, curses, and the idea that some legends had a kernel of truth. She wasn't thrilled about Jake's plan, but she went along with it, partly out of loyalty, and partly because she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the story. Logan was the wild card, a quiet observer who rarely spoke, but always seemed to know more than he let on. Tall and lanky, with a mop of black hair that obscured his eyes, he had a knack for noticing things others overlooked. Logan was drawn to the strange and the macabre, often sketching dark, intricate drawings in a battered notebook he carried everywhere. He didn't believe in Bloody Mary, not exactly, but he wasn't as quick to dismiss the possibility as Jake. "There's always a reason for stories like this," he said once. "They don't come from nowhere." The place they chose for the ritual was the old Chesterfield Manor, a sprawling, decaying estate on the outskirts of town. Once a symbol of wealth and prestige, the manor had been abandoned for decades, its grandeur reduced to rot and ruin. Its windows were shattered, its walls covered in creeping ivy, and its roof sagged under the weight of neglect. The townsfolk avoided it like the plague, claiming it was cursed, though no one could agree on why. Some said the last owner had gone mad. Others whispered of strange lights and sounds in the dead of night. To the 4 teenagers, it was perfect. The bathroom was the heart of the manor's unease. Tucked away at the end of a long, narrow corridor on the 2nd floor, it was a small, windowless room with cracked tiles and a rust-streaked sink. The mirror above the sink was intact, though its surface was tarnished, as if something had seeped into the glass and left a permanent stain. The door creaked ominously on its hinges, and the air inside felt heavy, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. The group arrived just after sunset, their flashlights cutting through the encroaching darkness. The manor loomed above them, its jagged silhouette stark against the purple-black sky. The wind howled through the broken windows, carrying with it the faint, mournful sound of creaking wood. "Creepy as hell," Jake muttered, his bravado faltering for a moment. Emily rolled her eyes. "You're the one who wanted to do this," she reminded him. Inside, the air was damp and cold, carrying the sour tang of mold and decay. Their footsteps echoed in the empty halls, each creak of the floorboards sounding louder than the last. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the remnants of shattered furniture lay scattered like forgotten bones. Every so often they thought they heard something, a faint whisper, a shuffle in the darkness. But when they turned, there was nothing there. By the time they reached the bathroom, tension hung thick in the air. The small room felt even more claustrophobic than it had in the daylight, the shadows pressing in from every corner. The mirror loomed above the sink, its surface catching the light of their flashlights and throwing it back in strange, fractured patterns. Emily's stomach churned as she stared at her reflection, distorted and ghostly in the tarnished glass. "This is stupid," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. Jake grinned, though the unease in his eyes betrayed him. "It's just a mirror," he said, pulling the candle from his bag. He struck a match, the small flame flickering to life and casting their shadows long and thin against the walls. Let's get this over with. As they positioned themselves in front of the mirror, a sudden gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing their flashlights. The candle flickered but held, its feeble light the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. Sarah shivered, clutching her arms as goosebumps prickled her skin. "Maybe we shouldn't," she whispered. But Jake ignored her, his focus fixed on the mirror. "Ready?" he asked, his voice louder than necessary. Emily nodded reluctantly, her heart pounding in her chest. Logan stayed silent, his gaze locked on the mirror as though searching for something he couldn't name. Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door, but she stayed. Jake grinned, his voice dripping with false confidence. "All right, here goes. Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary." He paused, his reflection staring back at him, the candlelight dancing across his face. The room seemed to hold its breath. Bloody Mary. For a moment, nothing happened. The four of them stood in silence, the candle casting wavering shadows across the cracked tiles. Then, the temperature dropped. The candle's flame sputtered, and a faint sound echoed through the room. A low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from the mirror itself. And just like that, the game had begun. The idea to summon Bloody Mary didn't come all at once. It began as a whisper, a reckless joke tossed around like a live grenade during one of those endless nights when boredom seemed to stretch like a void. It was Jake, of course, who first suggested it. He always had a way of turning the group's collective unease into fuel for his daring schemes, and this time was no different. They were sitting in Emily's basement, a dimly lit space cluttered with old furniture and forgotten belongings, the kind of place where shadows seem to move on their own. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast an anemic yellow glow, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. A storm raged outside, thunder rumbling like distant growls, the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the narrow basement windows. Jake leaned back in the creaking armchair, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. "You know what we should do?" he said, his voice laced with a mix of excitement and challenge. Emily, curled up on the couch with her arms crossed, raised an eyebrow. "What now? Another one of your brilliant ideas to get us arrested?" Jake smirked, unfazed. No, this is different. Way better. We should summon Bloody Mary." The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Even the storm outside seemed to quiet for a moment, as though the name itself carried weight. Sarah, who had been thumbing through a dog-eared book, froze. Her eyes widened as she looked up at Jake, her face pale. "That's not funny, Jake," she said softly. "You don't mess with stuff like that." "Oh, come on," Jake replied, leaning forward. "It's just a stupid story. You stand in front of a mirror, say her name 3 times, and boom, nothing happens. People have been doing it for years." Logan, who had been sketching in his notebook, didn't look up. "Sometimes nothing happening is the best-case scenario," he said, his voice low and measured. Jake rolled his eyes. "You're all such babies. It's just a mirror and some words. What's the worst that could happen?" Emily shot him a glare. "The worst? You mean besides inviting a vengeful spirit into our lives? Or, I don't know, traumatizing Sarah for life?" Sarah shook her head, clutching her book tighter. "It's not just the story, Jake. People have disappeared. You've heard the rumors." "Rumors," Jake scoffed. "Urban legends. Stories parents tell kids to keep them from playing with candles and breaking their mirrors. Despite herself, Emily felt a flicker of curiosity. She'd grown up hearing the same stories Sarah had mentioned. Children who vanished after chanting Bloody Mary's name, mirrors shattered with blood smeared across the shards, and faint, inhuman whispers coming from behind closed doors. She didn't believe in ghosts, but there was something about the legend that got under her skin. Maybe it was the way her grandmother's voice trembled whenever she mentioned it, or the way she insisted on covering every mirror in the house after sunset. Still, Emily wasn't about to let Jake drag them into something stupid just to satisfy his ego. Even if nothing happens, it's not worth the risk, she said firmly. Jake leaned closer, his grin turning into a smirk. "You're scared," he said, his voice teasing. "You're all scared." Logan looked up from his notebook, his dark eyes meeting Jake's. Fear is usually a sign that you shouldn't do something. Or, Jake countered, it's a sign that you should. Come on, Logan. You of all people should be into this. Don't you love creepy stuff? Logan didn't answer, but his silence only seemed to encourage Jake. Turning to Sarah, Jake softened his tone. "Look, Sarah, I get it. It's just a silly game. But if it'll make you feel better, we'll do it together. Safety in numbers, right?" Sarah hesitated, biting her lip. "I don't know." Jake pounced on her hesitation like a predator sensing weakness. "That's the spirit. We'll prove it's all just a story, and then we can laugh about it later. What do you say?" Emily groaned, rubbing her temples. "You're impossible, you know that?" Jake grinned triumphantly. "That's a yes, then." The next few days were filled with Jake's relentless planning. He scoured the internet for proper instructions on how to summon Bloody Mary, poring over forums and YouTube videos with the enthusiasm of a mad scientist. Candles were apparently a must, as was complete darkness. The location, he insisted, had to be suitably creepy. An ordinary bathroom wouldn't cut it. That was when someone suggested Chesterfield Manor. The manor was infamous in Black Hollow, a crumbling relic of the town's past. It had been abandoned for decades, its once grand halls now home to graffiti and urban decay. Locals claimed it was haunted, though no one could agree on the details. Some said the last owner had gone insane. Others whispered of strange lights in the windows and ghostly figures seen in the dead of night. For Jake, it was perfect. For everyone else, it was a nightmare waiting to happen. On the night of the dare, the group gathered at the edge of the forest that surrounded Chesterfield Manor. The storm from earlier in the week had passed, but the air was thick and heavy, carrying the faint scent of rain and decay. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the overgrown path that led to the manor. Emily shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "This is such a bad idea," she muttered. Jake, carrying a backpack filled with candles, a lighter, and a flashlight, turned to her with a grin. "Relax, it's going to be fun." Sarah trailed behind them, clutching a small rosary she'd brought from home. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously to the shadows that seemed to close in around them. "I don't think we should do this," she said quietly. Logan walked silently at the back of the group, his notebook tucked under his arm. He hadn't said much since Jake announced his plan, but his presence was steady, a quiet reassurance amidst the growing tension. As they reached the manor, its towering silhouette loomed above them like a blackened skeleton against the night sky. The wind howled through the broken windows, carrying with it a low, mournful sound that could have been the groaning of the building, or something else entirely. "Creepy as hell," Jake said, his voice betraying a hint of unease. "Perfect." They stepped inside, their flashlights casting long, flickering beams that barely seemed to cut through the darkness. The air was damp and cold, carrying the sour tang of mildew and decay. Every step they took echoed in the silence, the creak of the floorboards sounding louder than it should. By the time they reached the second-floor bathroom, Sarah was trembling, her grip on the rosary tight enough to turn her knuckles white. Emily felt her heart racing as she glanced around the small, claustrophobic space. The mirror above the sink was cracked but intact, its surface tarnished and clouded. Jake set the candle on the edge of the sink, his hands shaking slightly as he lit it. The flame flickered weakly, casting their faces in uneven, shifting shadows. "All right," he said, his voice unsteady. "Let's do this." "No turning back now," Emily muttered, her stomach twisting with dread. As the group gathered in front of the mirror, the air seemed to grow colder, the faint sound of the wind outside fading into an oppressive silence. For the first time, even Jake looked nervous. He cleared his throat, forcing a grin. "Here goes nothing," he said. And with that, he began to chant, "Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary." The candle flickered, and a chill swept through the room. Bloody Mary. The bathroom was impossibly dark despite the flickering candlelight, as though the shadows themselves were alive and pressing in from all sides. The group stood shoulder to shoulder, their reflections shifting eerily in the tarnished mirror. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the silence was broken only by the faint sound of their breathing, shallow and uneven. Jake stood in the center, clutching the candle like a talisman, his cocky grin now replaced by a mask of forced bravado. "All right," he whispered, his voice barely above a murmur. "Let's do this." Sarah's trembling hand gripped Emily's arm, her rosary clutched so tightly in her other hand that the beads dug into her skin. "We shouldn't," she whimpered, her voice quivering. "It's not too late to stop." Logan, standing slightly apart from the others, seemed unnaturally calm. His dark eyes were fixed on the mirror, unblinking, as though he were waiting for something. "We're already here," he said quietly, his voice carrying an unsettling finality. Emily's stomach churned as she looked at her own reflection. In the dim, flickering light, her face appeared distorted, the shadows twisting her features into something unfamiliar. "This is insane," she muttered. But despite her better judgment, she didn't move. Jake cleared his throat, forcing a weak laugh. "It's just a stupid game," he said, though his hand trembled as he raised the candle closer to the mirror. "Nothing's going to happen. Let's get this over with." The words felt hollow, even to him. He took a deep breath and began to chant, "Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary." The candle flame sputtered, its weak light flickering across the cracked surface of the mirror. For a moment, nothing happened. The group's reflections stared back at them, pale and ghostly, their eyes wide with apprehension. Bloody Mary. The final repetition hung in the air like a funeral bell. The room seemed to exhale, a faint whispering sound rising from the darkness. The candle flickered violently, and for a moment, the mirror's surface seemed to ripple as though it were made of water instead of glass. "What the hell was that?" Emily hissed, her voice tight with fear. Jake forced a grin, though the color had drained from his face. "Just your imagination," he said, but his voice wavered. "See? Nothing happened." Logan stepped closer to the mirror, his expression unreadable. "Something happened," he murmured, his breath fogging the glass. The room grew colder. Emily shivered as the chill seeped into her bones, and Sarah's grip on her arm tightened. The faint whispering sound grew louder, no longer coming from the air around them, but from the mirror itself. It was a low, guttural murmur, like a voice speaking in a language none of them understood. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing sound. "Yeah," Logan said, his eyes fixed on the mirror. "I heard it." The candle flame wavered again, and this time the shadows seemed to shift, crawling across the walls like living things. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she strained to make out the words. They were fragmented, broken, like voices carried on the wind. But one thing was clear: they were not alone. "Jake," Emily said sharply, her voice cutting through the oppressive noise. "Blow out the candle. Now." But Jake didn't move. He was staring at the mirror, his face pale and slack, his eyes wide with something between fear and fascination. "Do you see that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Emily turned her gaze to the mirror, her breath catching in her throat. At first it was subtle, a flicker of movement just beyond their reflections, like a shadow passing behind them. But then it became clear. There was something in the mirror. The figure was faint at first, its outline barely visible in the tarnished glass. But as the whispers grew louder, it began to take shape. A woman's face emerged, pale and gaunt, her hollow eyes burning with an unnatural light. Her hair hung in dark, matted strands, framing a mouth that twisted into a grotesque grin. Blood dripped from her cracked lips, staining the glass as though it were seeping through. Sarah let out a choked scream, stumbling backward and nearly dropping her rosary. "Oh my God," she whimpered, tears streaming down her face. "Oh my God, it's her!" Jake staggered back, his bravado shattered. "It's not real," he muttered, shaking his head as though trying to convince himself. "It's not real." But the figure in the mirror didn't disappear. Instead, it leaned closer, pressing its bloodied hands against the inside of the glass. The sound of nails scraping against the surface sent a shiver down Emily's spine, and she realized with dawning horror that the woman's movements didn't match their reflections. She wasn't mimicking them. She was moving independently. "Get out of here," Emily shouted, grabbing Jake by the arm. "We need to leave, now." But before they could move, the woman in the mirror opened her mouth. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the room, vibrating in their chests like a physical force. The glass began to crack, thin fractures spreading outward like a spider web. "She's coming," Logan said, his voice eerily calm. The mirror exploded. Shards of glass rained down around them, glittering like ice in the flickering candlelight. The sound was deafening, and for a moment, Emily thought she was screaming. But then she realized the sound wasn't coming from her. It was coming from the mirror, from the woman who had stepped through the shattered surface and into their world. She was taller than she had seemed in the mirror, her presence towering and oppressive. Her hair writhed like snakes, her eyes burning with a light that seemed to pierce through them. Blood dripped from her hands, pooling on the floor in dark, viscous puddles. The air grew thick, heavy with the stench of decay. Emily could barely breathe, her chest tightening as the woman stepped closer. "Jake!" she shouted, but he was frozen, his eyes locked on the figure before them. "Why did you call me?" the woman hissed, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. Did you think I wouldn't come?" Sarah let out a sob, clutching her rosary as though it could shield her from the horror before them. Logan stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable, while Jake stumbled backward, his bravado shattered. "We didn't mean to," Jake stammered, his voice cracking. "It was just a game." The woman's grin widened, her teeth jagged and stained with blood. "A game," she repeated, her voice dripping with mockery. "You think this is a game?" Her hand shot out, faster than any of them could react, and grabbed Jake by the throat. He let out a strangled gasp, his hands clawing at hers as she lifted him off the ground. The candle fell from his hand, extinguishing as it hit the floor, plunging the room into darkness. In the pitch-black silence, Emily could hear only the sound of Jake's desperate gasps and the woman's low, guttural laughter. Then, with a sickening crunch, the sound stopped. The darkness seemed to press in around them, suffocating and absolute. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears as she fumbled for her flashlight, her trembling hands finally finding the switch. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the room. But Jake was gone. The only sign of him was a smear of blood on the floor, trailing toward the shattered mirror. And then, the laughter began again. This time, it was all around them. The silence that followed was deafening, as if the entire world had been muffled. Emily's flashlight flickered weakly in her trembling hands, its beam cutting through the oppressive darkness of the bathroom. The room smelled of blood and decay, the scent clinging to the back of her throat, making her stomach churn. Jake was gone, vanished without a trace except for the slick trail of blood leading into the shattered mirror. "Where is he?" Sarah whimpered, clutching her rosary to her chest as her wide, tear-filled eyes darted around the room. Her voice cracked under the weight of her panic, barely audible over the pounding of her own heart. Emily didn't answer. She couldn't. Her voice felt trapped in her throat, along with the scream she so desperately wanted to release. Her gaze was locked on the mirror, or rather, what remained of it. The shards that hadn't fallen to the floor were jagged and uneven, their surfaces reflecting twisted, fractured versions of the room. But it wasn't their own reflections that terrified her. It was the shadow. Something moved within the broken glass. It slithered just beyond the edges of the fragments, its form shifting and unnatural, as though it were both there and not there at the same time. Emily's hand tightened around the flashlight, her knuckles white. She felt the air grow colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that her breath came out in visible puffs. "Emily," Logan's voice came from somewhere behind her. He was calm, too calm, and it sent a chill down her spine. "Don't move." She didn't have to ask why. She could feel it, the weight of a presence pressing down on her shoulders, the sensation of being watched. Slowly, as if every muscle in her body were fighting her, she turned her head. She wished she hadn't. There she was, Bloody Mary. Her form was grotesque, a distortion of human anatomy twisted into something out of a nightmare. Her pale, translucent skin clung tightly to her skeletal frame, veins dark and pulsing just beneath the surface. Her eyes glowed faintly, hollow orbs that seemed to burn with a cold, malevolent light. Blood dripped from her cracked lips, staining her chin and the front of her tattered, dirt-streaked gown. Her hair hung in long, matted strands that writhed as though alive, and her long, clawed fingers ended in blackened tips that scraped against the air with a sickening sound. "Why did you call me?" Bloody Mary hissed, her voice echoing like the sound of glass shattering underwater. Her head tilted unnaturally, the motion jerky and insect-like as she fixed her burning gaze on Emily. Emily's heart thundered in her chest, and she stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. "We didn't mean to," she stammered, her voice trembling. It was a mistake." "A mistake," Bloody Mary repeated, her grin widening to an impossible degree, her teeth sharp and yellowed. "A mistake that will cost you." Sarah screamed then, a high-pitched wail that shattered the fragile tension in the room. She bolted for the door, her rosary swinging wildly from her hands, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang before she could reach it. The sound reverberated through the room, shaking the walls, and Sarah fell to her knees, sobbing. "You can't leave," Bloody Mary said, her voice dripping with cruel amusement. "Not yet. The fun has only just begun." "Jake," Logan said, stepping forward. His voice was low, steady, but there was an edge to it, a quiet fury that Emily hadn't heard before. "Where is he?" Bloody Mary turned her hollow eyes toward him, her grin never faltering. "Your friend is safe," she said, though the word dripped with mockery. "For now." Logan didn't flinch. "Bring him back." The laughter that erupted from Bloody Mary's throat was a sound Emily would never forget, sharp, metallic, and otherworldly, like 1,000 shards of glass scraping against each other. "You think you can command me?" she sneered, stepping closer. With each movement, the air grew colder, the oppressive weight of her presence pressing harder against their chests. "You called me. You brought me here. Now you will face the consequences." Emily's flashlight flickered, the beam of light growing weaker by the second. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach for them. Panic clawed at her throat as she realized they were running out of time. She glanced at Logan, whose gaze was still locked on Bloody Mary, his expression unreadable. "What do you want?" Emily asked, forcing the words out before her courage failed her. "Why are you doing this?" Bloody Mary's grin widened, and she leaned closer, her breath cold and rancid against Emily's face. "What do I want?" she whispered. Her voice was softer now, almost intimate, and it sent a shiver down Emily's spine. "I want what was taken from me. I want to show you the pain of betrayal, of loss, of vengeance." Her clawed hand shot out, grabbing Emily's wrist with a grip like iron. The touch burned like ice, and Emily cried out, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, casting wild, erratic beams of light that illuminated the horror in flashes. Suddenly, the room shifted. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching and warping into unrecognizable shapes. The air grew thicker, and Emily's vision blurred as she felt herself being pulled, drawn toward the broken mirror. She clawed at the floor, her nails scraping against the tiles, but the force was relentless, dragging her closer to the shards. "Stop it!" Sarah screamed, lunging forward. She grabbed Emily's arm, pulling with all her strength, but it was like fighting against a tidal wave. The force was too strong, and Sarah's grip slipped. "Let her go!" Logan shouted, stepping between Emily and Bloody Mary. He raised his hands as if to push the spirit back, but Bloody Mary only laughed, her hollow eyes glowing brighter. "You're brave," she said, her tone mocking, "but bravery won't save you." Before Logan could react, Bloody Mary raised her hand and slashed at him with her claws. He stumbled back, blood blooming across his chest in dark streaks. He fell to his knees, clutching his shirt, his face pale but defiant.
Logan!
Emily screamed, her voice breaking. The laughter returned, filling the room as Bloody Mary straightened, her form towering over them. "You cannot fight me," she said. "You cannot escape. You belong to me now." Emily's mind raced, desperate for a way out. Her gaze fell on Sarah, who was still clutching her rosary, her lips moving in frantic, silent prayer. A spark of hope flickered in Emily's chest. "Sarah," she shouted, "keep praying." Sarah's eyes widened, her hands trembling as she tightened her grip on the rosary. She began to speak aloud, her voice shaky but growing stronger with each word. "Our Father, who art in heaven." The moment the prayer filled the room, Bloody Mary recoiled, a guttural hiss escaping her lips. The shadows faltered, retreating slightly, and the air grew marginally lighter. Emily scrambled to her feet, grabbing a shard of the broken mirror. It was sharp, jagged, and cold in her hand. Without thinking, she lunged at Bloody Mary, slashing at the spirit's outstretched arm. The shard cut through her form like smoke, but the spirit shrieked, her eyes burning with fury. "You cannot banish me," Bloody Mary roared, her voice shaking the walls. "You brought me here, and I will not leave until I have taken what is mine." Emily didn't stop. She swung the shard again, her movements fueled by desperation. Behind her, Sarah's prayers grew louder, filling the room with a trembling but undeniable light. Logan, bloodied but conscious, began to rise, his eyes burning with determination. The room shuddered, the oppressive force beginning to waver. Bloody Mary's form flickered, her edges blurring as though she were being pulled back into the shattered glass. Her screams echoed, a mix of rage and pain, as the light from Sarah's prayers intensified. Finally, with one last, ear-piercing wail, Bloody Mary was gone. The room fell silent, the air lightening as the oppressive darkness faded. But the mirror was still broken, and Jake was still gone. And deep within the shards, something moved. The silence that followed was deafening. The room, now dimly lit by the weak beam of Emily's flashlight, felt suffocatingly small. The oppressive chill lingered in the air, the kind that seeped into their bones and refused to leave. The mirror lay shattered across the floor, its jagged shards glinting ominously in the unsteady light. Every fragment seemed to hold a piece of the nightmare they'd just survived, each surface reflecting distorted images of their pale, horrified faces. Jake was gone. The blood trail leading into the mirror's shards remained as a grim reminder of his fate. Emily couldn't tear her eyes away from it, her mind racing with fragmented images of what had just transpired. "Jake." Sarah's voice broke the silence, trembling with despair. She sank to her knees, her rosary still clutched tightly in her hands. Tears streamed down her face, leaving trails in the dust and grime on her cheeks. "Where is he? What did she do to him?" Emily shook her head, unable to find words. She didn't know where Jake was. She didn't know if he was even alive. All she knew was the haunting image of Bloody Mary's skeletal grin and the way she had dragged him into the void. Logan, blood still seeping through his shirt from the gashes Bloody Mary had inflicted, leaned against the wall. His breathing was labored, his face pale, but his dark eyes remained sharp. "She took him," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "He's trapped." "Trapped?" Emily asked, her voice rising in panic. "In the mirror? In her world?" Logan nodded grimly. "That's where she came from, and that's where she takes those she claims." The words sent a shiver down Emily's spine. The thought of Jake, arrogant, reckless Jake, caught in some twisted, nightmarish version of reality, was almost too much to bear. But the bloodstains on the floor were proof that this wasn't just a bad dream. It was real. "We have to get him back," Emily said, her voice firmer than she felt. "We can't just leave him." "How?" Sarah whimpered. "How are we supposed to fight her? We barely survived." Emily didn't have an answer. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and guilt. This had been Jake's idea, yes, but she had let it happen. She could have stopped him, could have refused to come. Instead, she had followed him into this nightmare, and now he was gone. Logan pushed himself off the wall, wincing as his movement pulled at the wounds across his chest. "We need to leave this place," he said. "It's not safe here." Emily glanced at the broken mirror, unease creeping over her. What if she comes back? Logan's gaze flicked to the shards on the floor. "She's still here in a way," he said. "Pieces of her. Her presence lingers. If we stay too long..." He didn't finish the thought, but he didn't have to. The unspoken words hung in the air like a threat. Emily reached down and helped Sarah to her feet, her hand trembling as she gripped her friend's arm. "We'll figure out how to get Jake back," she said, her voice wavering but determined. "But first, we need to get out of here." They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls of Chesterfield Manor. The building seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, the air heavier. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind through the broken windows, felt like Bloody Mary's gaze lingering on them. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. When they finally stepped outside, the cold night air hit them like a slap. The forest surrounding the manor was eerily still, the trees towering like silent sentinels. The moon hung low in the sky, its light pale and sickly, casting long, thin shadows across the overgrown path. Emily turned back to the manor, its jagged silhouette looming in the darkness. "We'll come back," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "We have to." Logan didn't respond, his focus on the path ahead. Sarah clung to Emily's arm, her sobs quiet now, but her body still shaking. Together, they made their way back to town, each step heavy with the weight of what they had just endured. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Emily lay in her bed, the events of the evening replaying in her mind like a broken record. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shattered mirror, the bloodstains, the clawed hands reaching out of the void. She saw Jake's terrified face as he was pulled away, and Bloody Mary's twisted grin as she disappeared into the darkness. She rolled over, staring at the small mirror on her dresser. Her reflection stared back, pale and haunted. For a moment, she thought she saw something else, a flicker of movement just behind her. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding, but the mirror was still. Her reflection hadn't changed. Emily got up and threw a scarf over the mirror, her hands trembling. She couldn't bring herself to look at it again. In the days that followed, the haunting presence of Bloody Mary seemed to follow them all. Emily woke up to find her bathroom mirror cracked, a single bloody handprint smeared across the glass. Sarah swore she heard whispers in the middle of the night, voices coming from the mirrors in her home. Logan reported waking up to deep scratches on his bedroom walls, as though something had been trying to claw its way inside. And then there were the dreams. Each of them experienced vivid, horrifying nightmares. Emily dreamed of endless corridors lined with mirrors, each one showing a distorted version of herself. In every reflection, Bloody Mary was behind her, her bloodied hands reaching out. Sarah's dreams were filled with the sound of shattering glass and Jake's screams echoing in the darkness. Logan dreamed of the shattered mirror reforming itself, the shards pulling together to reveal Bloody Mary's face, her eyes burning with rage. None of them talked about the dreams at first, but it became impossible to ignore. They met in Emily's basement again, the dim light and familiar surroundings doing little to ease their growing unease. "She's not done with us," Logan said, his voice heavy. "We woke something up, and now it's following us." Sarah hugged her knees to her chest, her rosary dangling from her fingers. "I can't sleep," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I close my eyes, she's there." Emily clenched her fists, anger rising to mask her fear. "We have to do something," she said. "We can't just sit here and wait for her to pick us off one by one." Logan nodded, his jaw tightening. "We need to find a way to banish her, for good." "But how?" Sarah asked, tears streaming down her face. "How do you fight something like that?" Logan pulled out his notebook, flipping to a page filled with dark, intricate sketches. One drawing stood out, a broken mirror with Bloody Mary's face emerging from the shards. Beneath it were scribbled notes, fragmented research he'd been compiling since the night at the manor. "There are stories," he said, "old rituals, ways to trap her, maybe even destroy her. It won't be easy, but it's possible." Emily nodded, determination hardening her features. "Then we'll do it, whatever it takes." The group sat in silence, the weight of their decision settling over them like a heavy blanket. The room felt colder, the air thicker, as though the shadows themselves were listening. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. And somewhere, in the distance, came the faint sound of glass shattering. They weren't alone. The whispers about Bloody Mary had been circulating for centuries, passed down in fragments and half-truths, each storyteller adding their own twist to her origin. Some claimed she was a witch burned at the stake. Others believed she was a noblewoman betrayed by her own family. But as Emily, Logan, and Sarah began to delve deeper into the legend, they uncovered a story far darker than they could have imagined. A tale of betrayal, despair, and vengeance that defied the bounds of mortality. It began in the 17th century, in a small, isolated village on the edge of an ancient forest. The village, surrounded by towering trees and shrouded in perpetual mist, was as insular as it was superstitious. It thrived on the belief that the world beyond its borders was a dangerous, cursed place, filled with things better left unseen. And yet, amidst this backdrop of fear and isolation, there was one soul who dared to defy the norms of her time. Her name was Mary Worthington, and she was beautiful in a way that seemed almost otherworldly. Her skin was as pale as moonlight, her hair a cascade of raven black waves, and her eyes an icy blue that seemed to pierce through the soul of anyone who met her gaze. But it wasn't just her beauty that set her apart. It was her intellect, her independence, and the way she moved through the world as though she belonged to no one. Mary was the village healer, a role she had inherited from her mother, who had died under mysterious circumstances when Mary was just a child. Her knowledge of herbs and remedies was unparalleled, and many in the village owed their lives to her skill. But her talents, combined with her striking appearance, made her a target for suspicion. Whispers of witchcraft began to circulate, fueled by the fear and ignorance of the villagers. Despite their mutterings, Mary continued her work, tending to the sick and injured with an almost supernatural precision. But her isolation deepened when she refused the advances of the village elder's son, a cruel and arrogant man named Thomas Grayson. He was used to getting what he wanted, and Mary's rejection humiliated him. The whispers grew louder, and Thomas fanned the flames, accusing her of consorting with dark forces. It didn't take long for the villagers to turn against her. One fateful night, a child in the village fell gravely ill. His skin burned with fever, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. Desperate, the boy's mother turned to Mary, begging her to save her son. Mary worked tirelessly, crafting poultices and administering remedies. But despite her efforts, the boy passed away before dawn. The villagers were inconsolable, their grief quickly turning to rage. Thomas seized the moment, his voice rising above the wails of the mourners. "This is her doing," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Mary. "She's cursed us all. She's a witch." The mob was relentless. Fueled by fear and grief, they dragged Mary from her small cottage, ignoring her protests and cries for mercy. They tied her to a stake in the center of the village, their faces twisted with hatred. The air was thick with the acrid smell of pitch as they lit the pyre, the flames licking hungrily at the night sky. Mary's screams echoed through the village, a sound so raw and anguished that even the forest seemed to fall silent. But as the fire consumed her, she didn't beg for forgiveness. Instead, she cursed them all. Her voice, though hoarse with pain, carried a chilling power that made the villagers freeze in place. "You will see my face again," she spat, her eyes burning with something far more potent than the flames. "In every mirror, in every reflection, I will find you. Your children will know my name, and their children after them. None of you will escape me. My vengeance will be eternal." As the fire consumed her, her laughter rose above the crackling flames, a sound that would haunt the villagers for generations. But Mary's story didn't end with her death. The night after the execution, strange things began to happen. The villagers heard whispers coming from their mirrors, soft and insidious, like a lover's breath on their skin. Reflections twisted and shifted, showing faces that weren't their own. People reported seeing Mary's ghostly visage staring back at them, her eyes filled with fury and her lips curling into a blood-stained smile. One by one, the villagers began to disappear. A farmer's wife vanished after seeing Mary's reflection in her wash basin. A young girl was found dead in her bed, her face frozen in a mask of terror, with shards of a broken mirror scattered around her. The village elder, Thomas's father, was the last to go, his body discovered in his home, surrounded by shattered glass and bloody handprints. The surviving villagers abandoned the settlement, fleeing into the forest and swearing never to speak of Mary again. But her curse persisted, traveling with them like an infection. Wherever they settled, mirrors became objects of dread, covered with cloth at night or smashed altogether. Children grew up hearing the warnings: never speak her name, never look too long into the glass, and never, under any circumstances, summon her. As Emily, Logan, and Sarah pieced together the fragments of Mary's story, they began to understand the depth of her rage and the futility of their situation. She wasn't just a spirit seeking revenge. She was something far darker, a force of nature born from betrayal and suffering. "It's not just about the ritual," Logan said one night as they pored over old books and online forums. "It's about her curse. She bound herself to mirrors, to reflections, That's how she reaches us." "But why does she kill?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Why does she take people?" Logan's expression was grim. "Because she can't rest. Her hatred is what keeps her here, and she wants us to feel the same pain she felt." Emily stared at the cracked mirror they had retrieved from Chesterfield Manor. The shard in her hand was cold, almost pulsing with an unnatural energy. "So what do we do?" she asked. "How do we stop her?" Logan didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "We have to break the connection," he said. "Destroy the mirrors she's bound to. But it won't be easy. Every shard, every fragment, she's tied to all of them. And if we don't destroy them all, she'll come back," Sarah finished, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily clenched her fists, the weight of their task settling heavily on her shoulders. Mary's story was a tragedy, yes, but it had become a nightmare. And now it was up to them to end it, before it ended them. That night, as Emily stared into her own reflection, she thought she saw something move. A flicker of shadow, a glint of light where there shouldn't have been. Her heart raced as she leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass. And then she heard it. A whisper. So faint, it could have been her imagination. But it wasn't. "I'm waiting." The curse of Bloody Mary didn't merely haunt the nights. It seeped into the cracks of their lives, lingering like a dark stain that refused to wash away. The days were heavy with silence, the nights filled with a suffocating dread. The three of them, Emily, Logan, and Sarah, found themselves spiraling into paranoia, each carrying the weight of their encounter with something they couldn't explain, let alone escape. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow moving just out of the corner of their eyes. Emily was the first to notice it. At first, she thought the sleepless nights and constant anxiety were playing tricks on her. Her reflection seemed different, not wrong exactly, but off. The way it moved, how its eyes lingered a second too long on hers, how its smile seemed faintly twisted even when her lips were pressed in a grim line. One evening, as she was brushing her teeth, Emily caught her reflection staring at her, unblinking. Her own hands froze mid-motion, but the reflection's arms continued moving, the brush dragging across her teeth with a sound that scraped against her nerves. The toothpaste dribbled down its chin like blood, staining the front of its shirt. She screamed, spinning away from the mirror, her back pressing against the cold tile wall. When she dared to look again, the reflection was normal, but her toothbrush lay shattered in the sink. Sarah, always the most devout among them, clung desperately to her faith. She slept with her rosary under her pillow, whispered prayers before every meal, and burned candles in every room of her house. But even her faith began to fracture under the weight of Mary's curse. It started with the voices. Soft at first, almost like a lullaby, but the words were incoherent, gibberish that sent chills down her spine. She heard them at night, drifting from her bedroom mirror. She covered it with a blanket, but the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent. Sometimes she thought she heard Jake's voice among them, crying out for help, his screams muffled as though he were speaking from underwater. One night, as Sarah clutched her rosary and whispered the Lord's Prayer, the voices stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. Then she heard it. A single knock, sharp and deliberate, coming from the other side of her covered mirror. She froze, the prayer caught in her throat. "Sarah, A voice whispered her name, soft and seductive. It wasn't Jake's voice. It was hers. Mary's. The blanket over the mirror rippled as though something were pressing against it, the faint outline of a hand sliding down the fabric. Sarah screamed, throwing the rosary at the mirror and fleeing the room. She didn't sleep that night, or any night after without the lights on. Logan's descent was different. Where Emily and Sarah tried to avoid the mirrors, Logan couldn't look away. He became obsessed, poring over books, online forums, and any scrap of information he could find about Bloody Mary. He filled his notebook with frantic sketches, twisted faces emerging from glass, jagged mirrors dripping with blood, dark shapes writhing in shadows. He stopped sleeping, his nights consumed by research, and his days haunted by the weight of what they had unleashed. His room became a fortress, every reflective surface either covered or removed. But even in the safety of darkness, he couldn't escape her. One night, as he sat hunched over his desk, Logan felt the unmistakable sensation of someone standing behind him. He didn't move at first, his fingers gripping his pen so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Slowly, he turned his head, his heart pounding in his chest. There was nothing there. Relieved, he turned back to his notebook, only to find that the page he'd been writing on was now blank. He blinked, confused, before the words began to reappear, scrawling themselves across the page in blood-red ink. "You can't save him." The pen dropped from his hand as his breathing quickened. The letters bled across the page, forming shapes. Mary's face, her blood-stained grin widening until it seemed to consume the entire page. Logan slammed the notebook shut and threw it across the room. But the image stayed burned into his mind. As the days stretched into weeks, the three of them began to unravel. The line between reality and nightmare blurred, and Mary's presence grew stronger. Her curse was no longer confined to mirrors. It seeped into their lives in insidious ways. Emily started finding shards of glass in her bed, tiny slivers that cut into her skin as she slept. She woke one morning to find her arms and legs covered in shallow scratches, as though clawed hands had reached out for her in the night. The scratches formed patterns, words she couldn't decipher, symbols that made her stomach churn. Sarah's house became a prison of fear. The whispers turned into screams, and the mirrors she tried to cover would tear themselves free, the blankets falling to the floor as if ripped by invisible hands. She began hearing footsteps in the hallways, the sound of glass crunching underfoot, though there was no one there. Her rosary turned black, the beads crumbling to dust in her hands. Logan isolated himself completely. He stopped answering their calls, his obsession with Mary consuming him entirely. Emily and Sarah visited his house one evening, desperate to check on him, but found the door locked and the windows covered with black paint. When they finally broke in, they found his room plastered with drawings, hundreds of them, covering every inch of the walls. Each one depicted Mary, her hollow eyes staring out from the paper, her grin wide enough to split her face. Logan sat in the corner, his knees drawn to his chest, muttering to himself. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hands were covered in cuts, as though he'd been clawing at the walls. "She's here," he whispered, rocking back and forth. "She's always here." The final straw came when Jake's voice began calling to them, not in dreams or whispers, but loud and clear, as though he were standing right beside them. Emily heard it first, late at night, as she stared at the covered mirror in her room. "Emily," the voice said, soft and pleading. "Help me." She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. "Jake?" she whispered. "Please," the voice begged. "She's hurting me." Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she stepped closer to the mirror, her hand reaching out to touch the fabric covering it. "Where are you?" she asked. "How do I—" The fabric fell away, and there he was. Jake's face stared back at her, pale and gaunt, his eyes filled with terror. "Get me out," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, Emily, before she—" Something dark and clawed grabbed him from behind, dragging him out of view. Mary's face filled the mirror, her bloodied grin spreading wide as she laughed, a sound that shattered Emily's composure. In that moment, Emily realized the truth. Mary wasn't just haunting them. She was playing with them, pulling them deeper into her web, feeding off their fear. And unless they found a way to stop her, she wouldn't just haunt them, she would consume them. The madness was no longer creeping, it was crashing down around them. Each of them was caught in Mary's grip, their lives unraveling with every passing moment. And as the shadows grew darker, one thing became clear. The only way to escape was to confront her. But Mary wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The night of the final confrontation was drenched in an oppressive stillness, the kind of silence that felt alive, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Emily, Sarah, and Logan stood outside Chesterfield Manor, the building's decayed frame looming against a sky that churned with thick, roiling clouds. The air was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of decay and something metallic, like blood. Emily tightened her grip on the crowbar in her hand, her knuckles white. "This is it," she said, her voice trembling. "We end it tonight." Sarah, clutching a flashlight and her rosary, nodded, though her wide, tear-filled eyes betrayed her terror. Logan, pale and hollow-eyed but determined, carried a battered satchel filled with supplies: salt, candles, matches, and pages of scribbled notes he'd pieced together from weeks of frantic research. His voice was low and steady, but his gaze never wavered from the manor's darkened entrance. "She won't make this easy," Logan said. "She's been toying with us, but now she knows we're coming for her." Sarah shivered. "What if we fail? What if we make things worse?" Emily glanced at her friend, her jaw tightening. "We won't," she said, though the certainty in her voice was a lie. She couldn't afford to show doubt, not now. "We're getting Jake back, and we're putting an end to this." Logan pushed the heavy wooden door open, its hinges groaning like a dying animal. The air inside was frigid and thick with dust, the faint smell of mold and rot clinging to the walls. Their flashlights cut through the gloom, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Stick together," Logan said as they stepped inside. "No matter what." The manor was worse than Emily remembered. The walls seemed to close in on them as they made their way through the narrow corridors, the floorboards creaking ominously under their weight. The mirrors that hung on the walls were cracked and fogged, their surfaces reflecting warped, ghostly images of the group. Every so often they heard faint noises, the sound of footsteps on the floor above, a whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, the soft, rhythmic tap of something sharp against glass. Sarah gripped her rosary so tightly that her fingers began to ache, her whispered prayers filling the air like a fragile shield. "It's her," Logan muttered, his eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to gather in the corners of the room. "She knows we're here." Emily stopped in front of the bathroom door, the very room where they had first summoned her. The door was slightly ajar, the darkness inside impenetrable. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pushed it open, the flashlight beam sweeping across the room. The mirror was gone. "She's not here," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Logan frowned, pulling a notebook from his satchel and flipping through the pages. "She's moved," he said. "She's in her world now, the mirror world. That's where she's holding Jake." Emily stared at him, dread pooling in her stomach. "How do we get there?" Logan met her gaze, his expression grim. "We have to call her again." Logan set the supplies on the floor, arranging the salt in a circle large enough for all three of them. He lit the candles, their flames flickering weakly in the oppressive air. The group knelt inside the circle, their flashlights turned off, leaving the room illuminated only by the faint, wavering glow of the candles. "Are you sure this will work?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Logan nodded, though his hands trembled as he held the notebook. "It has to." Emily took a deep breath, her palms slick with sweat. "Let's do this." They joined hands, their grips tight, as Logan began to chant. The words were strange, guttural, and ancient, scraping against their ears like nails on a chalkboard. The temperature in the room plummeted, their breath visible in the flickering candlelight. The air grew heavier, the darkness thickening around them. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to leer at them. The mirrors on the walls began to rattle, their cracked surfaces shimmering like liquid. And then she came. The candles extinguished in an instant, plunging the room into darkness. The only light came from the mirrors, their surfaces glowing faintly with a sickly, unnatural light. A guttural laugh echoed through the room, sending shivers down their spines. "You came back," Bloody Mary hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "Fools." Emily gritted her teeth, her grip tightening on Logan and Sarah's hands. "We're here for Jake," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Let him go." Mary's laughter grew louder, filling the room like a physical force. Her form began to emerge from one of the mirrors, her skeletal frame stretching and twisting as she stepped into their world. Her eyes burned with an unnatural light, her blood-stained grin wide enough to split her face. "Why should I?" she sneered, her claws glinting in the faint light. "He's mine now." Emily's heart pounded as she met Mary's gaze. "You want us," she said, her voice shaking. "Not him. We're the ones who called you. Take us instead." Mary tilted her head, her grin widening. "How noble," she mocked. "But I don't make trades." The shadows surged forward, slamming against the circle of salt. The group cried out as the force rattled their bones, but the salt held, the barrier keeping Mary at bay, for now. Logan pulled a shard of broken mirror from his satchel, its edges jagged and sharp. "This is the key," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "We can use it to cross into her world." Emily stared at him, her stomach twisting. "What happens if we go in there?" Logan didn't answer. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes said it all. Without another word, he pressed the shard to his palm, slicing a thin line across his skin. Blood dripped onto the glass, and the shard began to glow, its surface rippling like water. He held it out to Emily and Sarah, his expression grim. "Take my hand," he said. "We go together." They hesitated for only a moment before grabbing hold. The shard pulsed in Logan's hand, and the world around them dissolved into darkness. The mirror world was a nightmare made real. The air was thick and cold, the ground beneath their feet slick with blood. Shadows writhed like living things, their shapes impossible to comprehend. The only light came from the fractured reflections that floated in the air, each one showing a twisted version of reality. In the distance, they saw him. Jake was trapped in a cage of glass, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes filled with terror. Bloody Mary stood beside him, her claws tracing lazy patterns in the air. "You came all this way," she said, her voice echoing. "But you'll never leave." Emily stepped forward, her jaw clenched. "We're not afraid of you." Mary's laughter echoed through the mirror world, a sound that made their skin crawl. "You should be." The confrontation was a blur of chaos and terror. Mary's claws lashed out, tearing through the air as the group fought desperately to free Jake. Logan used the shard to deflect her attacks, its glowing surface burning her flesh when it made contact. Sarah's prayers filled the air, the words of fragile light in the suffocating darkness. Emily reached Jake's cage, her hands trembling as she pried at the glass. Mary screamed in rage, her form distorting as she lunged toward them. "Now, Logan!" Emily shouted. Logan raised the shard, plunging it into the ground. The mirror world shuddered, the reflections shattering into 1,000 pieces. Mary let out a piercing wail as her form dissolved, her screams fading into silence. The group awoke on the floor of the manor, their bodies bruised and battered, but alive. Jake lay beside them, unconscious but breathing. The mirrors were shattered, their surfaces dark and lifeless. Emily sat up, her heart pounding as she looked around. "Is it over?" she whispered. Logan nodded, his face pale. "For now." But as they left the manor, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, in some dark corner of reality, Bloody Mary was still watching and waiting. The air outside Chesterfield Manor was sharp and cold, biting through their clothes as Emily, Logan, Sarah, and Jake emerged from the decaying building. The night was eerily silent, as though the world had paused to acknowledge the horrors they had endured. The weight of what had transpired hung heavily over them, pressing down like an invisible force. They were alive, but they were not whole. Jake was pale and silent, his once cocky demeanor replaced with a haunted emptiness. His eyes darted around, scanning the shadows as if expecting Bloody Mary to step out from them at any moment. Sarah clung to Emily's arm, her grip trembling, the rosary in her hand cracked and worn. Logan walked a few steps behind, his face gaunt and his hands shaking despite his attempts to steady them. They didn't speak as they trudged down the overgrown path, each lost in their thoughts, each trying to process the nightmare they had barely escaped. But deep down, Emily knew it wasn't over. The days that followed were a blur of restless sleep, hushed conversations, and a pervasive sense of unease. Jake refused to talk about what he had seen in the mirror world, his silence a wall none of them could breach. He jumped at every sudden noise, his hands trembling whenever he passed a reflective surface. Once, Emily caught him staring into a window for far too long, his face twisted in an expression of fear and confusion. She had to physically pull him away, and even then, he muttered under his breath, "She's still there, watching." Sarah became withdrawn, retreating into her faith with a desperation that bordered on obsession. She filled her home with candles, crosses, and religious artifacts, but even they didn't seem to bring her peace. She often woke screaming in the middle of the night, her dreams plagued by visions of Bloody Mary's twisted smile and Jake's cage of glass. Logan buried himself in research, poring over books and online forums, trying to understand the nature of what they had encountered. He was convinced that they hadn't truly destroyed Bloody Mary. that she was still out there, lurking in the fragments of shattered mirrors, waiting for her chance to return. "She's bound to reflections," he told Emily one evening, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "We didn't kill her. We just disrupted her. For now." Emily wanted to believe they had won, that they had escaped. But strange things kept happening. The mirrors they had shattered seemed to reappear, their surfaces whole and pristine, as though mocking their attempts to destroy them. She began to notice faint smudges on reflective surfaces, handprints, claw marks, sometimes even the faint outline of a face. Her reflection moved when she wasn't looking, its eyes following her even as her head turned away. And then there were the whispers, soft, insidious, and impossible to ignore. They came at night, threading through the silence like a dark melody. They called her name, beckoning her to return, to finish what had been started. At first, she thought she was imagining them, a product of her frayed nerves. But when she mentioned them to Logan, his face darkened. "You're hearing them too," he said. It wasn't a question. The truth was inescapable. They had awakened something ancient and malevolent, and it had no intention of letting them go. Bloody Mary's presence clung to them like a shadow, growing stronger with each passing day. They tried to move on, to pretend that life could return to normal, but the scars ran too deep. Jake disappeared first. One morning, Emily went to his house to check on him and found the door ajar, the interior eerily silent. She stepped inside, calling his name, her voice echoing off the empty walls. The living room mirror was shattered, the shards scattered across the floor in a chaotic pattern. And in the center of it all was a single, bloody handprint. She searched every room, her panic growing with each empty space. His bedroom was untouched, the bed neatly made, his belongings arranged as though he had simply stepped out for a moment. But the mirror above his dresser was pristine, its surface gleaming despite the darkness. As Emily stared into it, she swore she saw a faint outline, a shadow that didn't belong to her, its hollow eyes watching her with cruel amusement. Jake was never found. Jake's disappearance fractured the group. Sarah withdrew entirely, refusing to answer calls or open her door. Emily visited her once, pounding on the door until her hands ached, but Sarah's voice from the other side was barely a whisper. "I can't," she said. "I can't talk to you. I can't see you. She'll follow." "She's already here," Emily replied, her voice cracking. "You can't hide from her." But Sarah didn't answer, and Emily left, her heart heavy with despair. Logan, meanwhile, spiraled deeper into obsession. He began conducting rituals in his basement, desperate to find a way to banish Bloody Mary for good. When Emily confronted him, his eyes were bloodshot, and his hands were covered in burns from candle wax. "There has to be a way," he insisted, his voice frantic. "She's tied to the mirrors, to the reflections. If we can sever that connection—" "She's feeding on us," Emily interrupted, her voice trembling. "She's tearing us apart." Logan stared at her, his expression hardening. "Then we fight back." One night, Emily woke to find her bedroom mirror glowing faintly in the darkness. Her heart raced as she stared at it, the air in the room growing colder with each passing second. Slowly, she rose from the bed, her bare feet pressing against the cold floor. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and a face began to emerge. It wasn't hers. Bloody Mary's eyes burned with cruel delight as she leaned closer, her bloodied grin wide enough to split her face. "You can't escape me," she whispered. "You called me, and now you are mine." Emily stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The mirror shattered, the sound deafening in the silence of the night. When she turned on the lights, the room was empty, but the shards of glass were scattered across the floor, each one reflecting Mary's twisted smile. Chesterfield Manor was eventually torn down, its ruins left to rot in the shadow of the forest. But the legend of Bloody Mary didn't die with it. If anything, it grew stronger, spreading through whispers and stories told around flickering campfires. They say that if you stand before a mirror in the dead of night and call her name 3 times, she'll come for you. Some claim it's just a game, a harmless ritual meant to scare children, but others know better. They've heard the whispers, seen the shadows that don't belong, and felt the cold breath of something ancient and unforgiving. Emily, Logan, and Sarah's names faded from the town's memory, their fates becoming just another part of the legend. But those who dared to summon Bloody Mary knew the truth. She was always watching, always waiting, and she never forgot those who dared to call her name.